Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Corner Cafe. Today is the sixth episode of the podcast, and today I'll be reading The Silent Patient. The audiobook The Silent Patient is just recommended by my friend, so I thought I should bring it to you. And it is sort of a learning for you, and we'll be reading and we'll be covering the vocabulary words afterwards, obviously not during the narration, and we'll try to learn and we'll see what sort of a novel it is. So it's a bestseller book. So just without further delaying, there is a thought of the day I would just like to share. And the thought of the day is that the room without a book is just like a body without a soul. So let's start with the podcast. Alicia Berenson was 33 years old when she killed her husband. They had been married for 7 years. They were both artists. Alicia was a painter, Gabriel was a well known fashion photographer. He had a distinctive style, shooting semi starved, semi naked women at strange, unflattering angles. Since his death, the price of his photographs has increased astronomically. I find this stuff rather slick and shallow, to be honest. It has none of the visceral quality of Alicia's best work. Of course, I don't know enough about art to say whether Alicia Berenson will stand the test of time as a painter. Her talent will always be overshadowed by her notoriety, so it's hard to be objective. And you might well accuse me of being biased. All I can offer is my opinion for what it's worth, and to me, Alicia was a kind of genius. Apart from her technical skill, her paintings have an uncanny ability to grab your attention by the throat almost and hold it in a vice like grip. Gabriel Berenson was murdered 6 years ago. He was 44 years old. He was killed on 25th of August. It was an unusually hot summer, you may remember, with some of the highest temperatures ever recorded. The day he dies was the hottest of the year. On the last day of his life, Gabriel rose early. A car collected him at 5:15 a.m. from the house he shared with Alicia in north west London, on the edge of Hampstead Heath, and he was driven to a shoot in Shoreditch. He spent the day photographing models on a rooftop for Vogue magazine. Not much is known about Alicia's movements. She had an upcoming exhibition and was behind with her work. It's likely she spent the day painting in the summer house at the end of the garden, which she had recently converted into a studio. In the end, Gabriel's shoot ran late and he was driven home until 11 p.m. Half an hour later, their neighbor Barbie Hellman heard several gunshots. Barbie phoned the police and a car was dispatched from the station on Harvestrock Hill at 11:35 p.m. It arrived at the Berenson's house in just under 3 minutes. The front door was open. The house was in pitch black darkness. None of the light switches worked. The officers made their way along the hallway and into the living room. They shone torches around the room, illuminating it in intermittent beams of light. Alicia was discovered standing by the fireplace. Her white dress glowed ghost-like in the torchlight. Alicia seemed oblivious to the presence of the police. She was immobilized, frozen, a statue carved from ice, with a strange, frightened look on her face, as if confronting some unseen terror. A gun was on the floor. Next to it, in the shadows, Gabriel was seated motionless, bound to a chair with a wire wrapped around his ankles and wrists. At first, the officers thought he was alive. His head was lolling slightly to one side, as if he were unconscious. Then a beam of light revealed Gabriel had been shot several times in the face. His handsome features were gone forever, leaving a charred, blackened, bloody mess. The wall behind him was sprayed with fragments of skull, brains, hairs, and blood. Blood was everywhere, splashed on the walls, running in the dark rivulets along the floor, along the grain of the wooden floorboards. The officers assumed it was Gabriel's blood, but there was too much of it. And then something glinted in the torchlight. A knife was on the floor by Alicia's feet. Another beam of light revealed the blood spattered on Alicia's white dress. An officer grabbed her arms and held them up to the light. There was deep cuts across the veins in her wrists. Fresh cuts, bleeding hard. Alicia fought off the attempts to save her life. It took 3 officers to restrain her. She was taken to the Royal Free Hospital only a few minutes away. She collapsed and lost consciousness on the way there. She had lost a lot of blood, but she survived. The following day, she lay in a bed in a private room at the hospital. The police questioned her in the presence of her solicitor. Alicia remained silent throughout the interview. Her lips were pale, bloodless. They fluttered occasionally but formed no words, made no sounds. She answered no questions. She could not, would not speak, nor did she speak when charged with Gabriel's murder. She remained silent when she was placed under arrest, refusing to deny her guilt or confess it. Alicia never spoke again. Her enduring silence turned their story from a commonplace domestic tragedy into something far grander, a mystery, an enigma that gripped the headlines and captured the public imagination for months to come. Alicia remained silent, but she made one statement, a painting. It was begun when she was discharged from hospital and placed under house arrest before the trial. According to the court appointed psychiatric nurse, Alicia barely ate or slept. All she did was paint. Normally, Alicia labored weeks, even months before embarking on a new picture, making endless sketches, arranging and rearranging the composition, experimenting with colors and form. A long gestation followed by a protracted birth as each brushstroke was painstakingly applied. Now, however, she drastically altered her creative process, completing this painting within a few days of her husband's murder. And for most people, this was enough to condemn her. Returning to the studio so soon after Gabriel's death betrayed an extraordinary insensitivity, the monstrous lack of remorse of a cold blooded killer. Perhaps, but let us not forget what Alicia Berenson may be a murderer. She was also an artist. It makes perfect sense, to me at least, that she should pick up her brushes and paints and express her complicated emotions on canvas. No wonder that for once painting came to her with such ease, if grief can be called easy. The painting was a self portrait. She entitled it in the bottom left hand corner of the canvas in light blue Greek lettering, one word, Alcestis. Alcestis is the heroine of a Greek myth, a love story of the saddest kind. Alcestis willingly sacrifices her life for her husband, Admetus, dying in his place when no one else will. An unsettling myth of self sacrifice. It was unclear how it related to Alicia's situation. The true meaning of the allusion remained unknown to me for some time until one day the truth came to light. But I am going too fast. I am getting ahead of myself. I must start at the beginning and let events speak for themselves. I must not color them, twist them, or tell any lies. I'll proceed step by step, slowly and cautiously. But where to begin? I should introduce myself, but perhaps not quite yet. After all, I am not the hero of this tale. It is Alicia Berenson's story, so I must begin with her and the Alcestis. The painting is a self portrait depicting Alicia in her studio at home in the days after the murder. Standing before an easel and a canvas, holding a paintbrush, she is naked. Her body is rendered in unsparing detail, strands of long red hair falling across bony shoulders, blue veins visible beneath translucent skin, fresh scars on both her wrists. She is holding a paintbrush between her fingers. It's dripping red paint, or is it blood? She is captured in the act of painting, and yet the canvas is blank. As is her expression. And yet the canvas is blank, as is her expression. Her head is turned over her shoulders and she stares straight out at us, mouth open, lips parted, mute. During the trial, Jane Felix Martin, who managed the small Soho gallery that represented Alicia, made the controversial decision, decried by many as sensationalist and macabre, to exhibit the Alcestis. The fact the artist was currently in the dock for killing her husband meant, for the first time in the gallery's long history, there was queues outside the entrance. I stood in line with the other prurient art lovers, waiting my turn by the neon red lights of a sex shop next door. One by one, we shuffled inside. Once in the gallery, we were herded towards the painting like an excitable crowd at a fairground making its way through a haunted house. Eventually, I found myself at the front of the line and was confronted with the Alcestis. I stared at the painting, staring into Alicia's face, trying to interpret the look in her eyes, trying to understand, but the portrait defied me. Alicia stared back at me, a blank mask, unreadable, impenetrable. I could divine neither innocence nor guilt in her expression. Other people found her easier to read. Pure evil, whispered the woman behind me. Isn't she? Her companion agreed. Cold blooded bitch. A little unfair, I thought, considering Alicia's guilt had yet not been proven. But in truth, it was foregone conclusion. The tabloids had cast her as a villain from the start, a femme fatale, a black widow, a monster. The facts, such as they were, simple. Alicia was found alone with Gabriel's body. Only her fingerprints were on the gun. There was never any doubt she killed Gabriel. Why she killed him, on the other hand, remained a mystery. The murder was debated in the media, and different theories were espoused in print and radio and on morning chat shows. Experts were brought in to explain, condemn, justify Alicia's actions. She must have been a victim of domestic abuse, surely pushed too far, before finally exploding. Another theory involved a sex game gone wrong. The husband was found tied up, wasn't he? Some suspected it was old fashioned jealousy that drove Alicia to murder. Another woman, probably. But at the trial, Gabriel was described by his brother as a devoted husband, deeply in love with his wife. Well, what about money? Alicia didn't stand to gain much by his death. She was the one who had money inherited from her father. And so it went on. Endless speculations, no answers, only more questions about Alicia's motives and her subsequent silence. Why did she refuse to speak? What did it mean? Was she hiding something? Protecting someone? If so, who? And why? At the time, I remember thinking that while everyone was talking, writing, arguing about Alicia, at the heart of his frantic, noisy activity, there was a void, a silence, a sphinx. During the trial, the judge took a dim view of Alicia's persistent refusal to speak. Innocent people, Mr. Justice Elverston pointed out, tended to proclaim their innocence loudly and not often. Alicia not only remained silent, but she showed no visible signs of remorse. She didn't cry once throughout the trial, a fact made much of in the press, her face remaining unmoved, cold, frozen. The defense had little choice but to enter a plea of diminished responsibility. Alicia had a long history of mental health problems, it was claimed, dating back to her childhood. The judge dismissed a lot of this as hearsay, but in the end he allowed himself to be swayed by Professor Lazarus Diomedes, professor of forensic psychiatry at Imperial College and clinical director of the Grove, a secure forensic unit in the North London. Professor Diomedes argued that Alicia's refusal to speak was in itself evidence of profound psychological distress and she should be sentenced accordingly. This was a rather roundabout way of saying something that psychiatrists don't like putting bluntly. Diomedes was saying Alicia was mad. It was the only explanation that made any sense. Why else tie the man you love to a chair and shoot him in the face at close range, and then express no remorse, give no explanation, not even speak? She must be mad. She had to be. In the end, Justice Elverston accepted the plea of diminished responsibility and advised the jury to follow suit. Alicia was subsequently admitted to the Grove under the supervision of the same Professor Diomedes, whose testimony had been so influential on the judge. The truth is, if Alicia weren't mad, that is, if her silence were merely an act, a performance for the benefit of the jury, then it had worked. She was spared a lengthy prison sentence, and if she proceeded to make a full recovery, she might well be discharged in a few years. Surely now was the time to begin faking that recovery. To utter a few words here and there, then a few more to slowly communicate some kind of remorse. But no. Weeks followed week, month followed month, and then years passed. And still Alicia didn't speak. There was simply silence. And so, with no further revelation forthcoming, the disappointed media eventually lost interest in Alicia Berenson. She joined the ranks of other briefly famous murderers, faces we remember but whose name we forget. Not all of us, it must be said, some people, myself included, continue to be fascinated by the myth of Alicia Berenson and her enduring silence. As a psychotherapist, it was obvious to me that she had suffered a severe trauma surrounding Gabriel's death, and this silence was a manifestation of the trauma, unable to come to terms with what she had done. Alicia stuttered and came to a halt like a broken car. I wanted to help start her up again, help Alicia tell her story to heal and get well. I wanted to fix her. Without wishing to sound boastful, I felt uniquely qualified to help Alicia Berenson. I'm a forensic psychotherapist and used to working with some of the most damaged, vulnerable members of society. And something about Alicia's story resonated with me personally. I felt a profound empathy with her right from the start. Unfortunately, I was still working at Broadmoor in those days, and so treating Alicia should have remained an idle fantasy. Had not fate unexpectedly intervened. Nearly 6 years after Alicia was admitted, the position of forensic psychotherapist became available at the Grove. As soon as I saw the advert, I knew I had no choice. I followed my gut and applied for the job. My name is Theo Faber. I am 42 years old and I became a psychotherapist because I was fucked up. That's the truth, though it's not what I said during the job interview. when the question was put to me. What drew you to psychotherapy, do you think? Asked Indra Sharma, peering at me over the rim of her owlish glasses. Indra was consultant psychotherapist at the Grove. She was in her late 50s with a round, attractive face and long jet black hair streaked with grey. She gave me a small smile as if to reassure me this was an easy question, a warm up volley, a precursor to trickier shots to follow. I hesitated. I could feel the other members of the panel looking at me. I remained conscious of maintaining eye contact as I trotted out a rehearsed response. A sympathetic tale about working part time in a care home as a teenager and how this inspired an interest in psychology, which in turn led to a postgraduate study of psychotherapy and so on. I wanted to help people, I suppose. I sighed with a shrug. That's it, really? Which was bullshit. I mean, of course, I wanted to help people, but that was a secondary aim, particularly at the time I started training. The real motivation was purely selfish. I was on a quest to help myself. I believe the same is true for most people who go into mental health. We are drawn to this particular profession because we are damaged. We study psychology to heal ourselves. Whether we are prepared to admit this or not is another question. As human beings, our earliest years reside in a land before memory. We like to think of ourselves as emerging from this primordial fog with our characters fully formed, like Aphrodite rising perfect from the sea foam. But thanks to increasing research into the development of the brain, we know this is not the case. We are born with the brain half formed, more like a muddy lump of clay than a divine Olympian. As the psychoanalyst Donald put it, there is no such thing as a baby. The development of our personalities doesn't take place in isolation, but in relationship with another. We are shaped and completed by unseen, unremembered forces, namely our parents. This is frightening for obvious reasons. Who knows what indignities were suffered, what torments and abuses in this land before memory. Our character was formed without us even knowing it. In my case, I grew up feeling edgy, afraid, anxious. This anxiety seemed to predate my existence and exist independently of me. But I suspect it originated in my relationship with my father, around whom I was never safe. My father's unpredictable and arbitrary rages made any situation, no matter how benign, into a potential minefield. An innocuous remark or a dissenting voice would trigger his anger and set off a series of explosions from which there was no refuge. The house shook as he shouted, chasing me upstairs into my room. I would dive under the bed and slide under it, against the wall. I would breathe in the feathery air, praying the bricks would swallow me up and I would disappear. But his hand would grab hold of me, drag me out to meet my fate. The belt would be pulled off and whistle in the air before it struck, each successive blow knocking me sideways, burning my flesh. Then the whipping would be over as abruptly as it had begun. I would be tossed to the floor, landing in the crumpled heap, a rag doll discarded by the angry toddler. I was never sure that I had gone to trigger his anger or if I deserved it. I asked my mother why my father was always so angry with me, and she would give a despairing shrug and say, "How should I know? Your father is completely mad. When she said he was mad, she wasn't joking. Were he to be assessed by a psychiatrist today, I suspect my father would be diagnosed with a personality disorder, an illness which went untreated for the duration of his life. The result was a childhood and adolescence dominated by hysteria and physical violence, threats, tears, and breaking glass. There were moments of happiness, of course, usually when my father was away from home. I remember one winter when he was in America on a business trip. For a month, for 30 days, my mother and I had free rein of the house and garden without his watchful eye. It snowed heavily in London that December, and the whole of our garden was buried beneath a thick, crisp white carpet. Mum and I made a snowman. Unconsciously or not, we built him to represent our absent master. I christened him Dad, and with his big belly, two black stones for eyes, two slanting twigs for stern eyebrows, there was indeed an uncanny resemblance. We completed the illusion by giving him my father's gloves, hat, and umbrella, and we then proceeded to pelt him violently with snowballs, giggling like naughty children. There was a heavy snowstorm that night. My mother went to bed and I pretended to sleep. Then I snuck out to the garden and stood under the falling snow. I held my hands outstretched, catching snowflakes, watching them vanish on my fingertips. It felt joyous and frustrating at the same time and spoke to some truth I could not express. My vocabulary was too limited, my words too loose a net in which to catch it. Somehow, grasping at vanishing snowflakes is like grasping at happiness, an act of possession, which instantly gives way to nothing. It reminded me that there was a world outside this house, a world of vastness and unimaginable beauty, a world that for now remained out of my reach. That memory has returned repeatedly to me over the years. It's as if the misery that surrounded me made that brief moment of freedom burn even brighter, a tiny light surrounded by darkness. My only hope of survival, I realized, was to retreat, physically as well as psychically. I had to get away, far away. Only then would I be safe. And eventually, at 18, I got the grades I needed to secure a place at university. I left that semi detached prison in Surrey and I thought was free. I was wrong. I didn't know it then, but it was too late. I had internalized my father, introjected him, buried him deep in my unconscious. No matter how far I ran, I carried him with me wherever I went. I was pursued by an infernal, relentless chorus of furies, all with his voice shrieking that I was worthless, shameful, a failure. During my first term at university, that first cold winter, the voices got so bad, so paralyzing that they controlled me. Immobilized by fear, I was unable to go out, socialize, or make any friends. I might as well have never left home. It was hopeless. I was defeated, trapped, backed into the corner, no way out. Only one solution presented itself. I went from chemist to chemist buying packets of paracetamol. I bought only a few packets at a time to avoid arousing suspicion. But I needed have worried. No one paid me the least attention. I was clearly as invisible as I felt. It was cold in my room and my fingers were numb and clumsy as I tore upon the packets. I took an immense effort to swallow all the tablets, but I forced them all down, pill after bitter pill. Then I crawled onto my uncomfortable narrow bed. I shut my eyes and waited for death. But death didn't come. Instead, a searing, gut-wrenching pain tore through my inside. I doubled up and vomited, throwing up bile and half-digested pills all over myself. I lay in the dark, a fire burning in my stomach for what seemed like eternity, and then slowly, in the darkness, I realized something. I didn't want to die, not yet, not when I hadn't lived, and this gave me a kind of hope. However murky and ill-defined, it propelled me at any rate to acknowledge that I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. I found it in the form of Ruth, a psychotherapist referred to me through the university counseling service. Ruth was white-haired and plump, and there was something grandmotherly about her. She had a sympathetic smile, a smile I wanted to believe in. She didn't say much at first. She just listened while I talked. I talked about my childhood, my home, my parents, and as I talked, I found that no matter how distressing the details I related, I could feel nothing. I was disconnected from my emotions like a hand severed from a wrist. I talked about painful memories and suicidal impulses, but couldn't feel them. I would, however, occasionally look up at Ruth's face, and to my surprise, tears would be collecting in her eyes, and she listened. This may seem hard to grasp, but those tears were not hers, they were mine. At the time, I didn't understand, but that's how therapy works. A patient delegates his unacceptable feelings to his therapist, and she holds everything he is afraid to feel, and she feels it for him. And then, ever so slowly, she feeds his feeling back to him, as Ruth feed mine back to me. We continued seeing each other for several years, Ruth and I. She remained the one constant in my life. Through her, I internalized a new kind of relationship with another human being, one based on mutual respect, honesty, and kindness, not recrimination, anger, and violence. I slowly started to feel differently inside about myself, less empty, more capable of feeling, less afraid. The hateful internal chorus never entirely left me, but I now had Ruth's voice to counter it, and I paid less attention. As a result, the voices in my head grew quieter and would temporarily vanish. I would feel peaceful, even happy sometimes. It was obvious that psychotherapy had quite literally saved my life, and more importantly, it had transformed the quality of that life. The talking cure was central to who I became. In a very profound sense, it defined me. It was, I knew, my vocation. After university, I trained as a psychotherapist in London. Throughout my training, I continued seeing Ruth. She remained supportive and encouraging. Although she warned me to be realistic about the path I was undertaking, it's no walk in the park was however she put it. She was right, working with patients, getting my hands dirty, well, it proved far from comfortable. I remember my first visit to a secure psychiatric unit. Within a few minutes of my arrival, a patient had pulled down his pants, squatted, and defected in front of me, a stinking pile of shit. And subsequent incidents, less stomach churning but just as dramatic, messy botched suicides, attempts at self harm, uncontained hysteria, and grief, all felt more than I could bear. But each time somehow I drew on hitherto untrapped resilience. It got easier. It's odd how quickly one adapts to the strange new world of a psychiatric unit. You become increasingly comfortable with madness, and not just the madness of others but your own. We are all crazy, I believe, just in different ways, which is why and how I relate to Alicia Berenson, I was one of the lucky ones thanks to a successful therapeutic intervention at a young age. I was able to pull back from the brink of psychic darkness. In my mind, however, the other narrative remained forever a possibility. I might have gone crazy and ended my days locked in an institution like Alicia, there but for the grace of God. Of course, I couldn't say any of this to Indira Sharma when she asked why I become a psychotherapist. It was an interview panel after all, and if nothing else, I knew how to play the game. In the end, I said I believe the training makes you into a psychotherapist regardless of your initial intentions. Indra nodded sagely, yes, quite right, very true. The interview went well. My experience of working at Broadmoor gave me an edge, Indra said, demonstrating I could cope with extreme psychological distress. I was offered the job on the spot and I accepted. 1 month later, I was on my way to the Grove. I arrived at the Grove, pursued by an icy January wind. The bare trees stood like skeletons along the road. The sky was white, heavy with snow that had yet to fall. I stood outside the entrance and reached for my cigarettes in my pocket. I hadn't smoked in over a week. I would promise myself that this time I meant it. I would quit for good. Yet here I was already giving in. I lit one, feeling annoyed with myself. Psychotherapists tend to view smoking as an unresolved addiction, one that any decent therapist should have worked through and overcome. I didn't want to walk in reeking of cigarettes, so I popped a couple of mints into my mouth and chewed them while I smoked, hopping from foot to foot. I was shivering, but if I am honest, it was more with nerves than cold. I was having doubts. My consultant at Broadmoor had made no bones about saying I was making a mistake. He hinted a promising career was being cut short by my departure, and he was sniffy about the Grove and Professor Dermades in particular. An unorthodox man does a lot work with group relations, worked with folks for a while, ran some kind of alternative therapeutic community in the 80s in Hertfordshire. Nor economically viable, those models of therapy, especially today. He hesitated a second, then went on in a lower voice, I am not trying to scare you, Theo, but I have heard rumblings about that place getting axed. You could find yourself out a job in 6 months. Are you sure you won't reconsider? I hesitated, but only of politeness. Quite sure, I said. He shook his head. Seems like a career suicide to me. But if you have made your decision. I didn't tell him about Alicia Berenson, about my desire to treat her. I could have put it in terms he might understand, that working with her might lead to a book or a publication of some kind, but I knew there was little point. He'd still say I was making a mistake. Perhaps he was right. I was about to find out. I stubbed out my cigarette, banished my nerves, and went inside. The Grove was located in the oldest part of Atwire Hospital. The original red brick Victorian building had long since been surrounded and dwarfed by larger and generally uglier additions and extensions. The Grove lay in the heart of his complex. The only hint of its dangerous occupants was the line of security cameras perched on the fences like watching birds of prey. In the reception, every effort had been made to make it appear friendly. Large blue couches, crude, childish artwork by the patients tapped to the walls. It looked to be me to more like a kindergarten than a secure psychiatric unit. A tall man appeared at my side. He grinned at me and held out his hand. He introduced himself as Yuri, head psychiatric nurse. Welcome to the Grove, Yuri said. Not much of a welcoming committee, I'm afraid, just me. Yuri was good looking, well built, and in his late 30s. He had dark hair and a tribal tattoo creeping up his neck, above his collar. He smelled of a tobacco and too much sweet after shave, and although he spoke with an accent, his English was perfect. I moved from here from Latvia 7 years ago, he said, and I didn't speak a word of English when I arrived, but in a year I was fluent. That's very impressive. Not really. English is an easy language. You should try Latvian. He laughed and reached for a jangling chain of keys around his belt. He pulled off a set and handed it to me. You will need these for an individual rooms, and there are codes you need to know for the other words. There's a lot. I had fewer keys at Broadmoor. Yeah, well, we stepped up security quite a bit recently since Stephanie joined us. Who is Stephanie? Yuri didn't reply, but nodded as the woman emerging from the office behind the reception desk. She was Caribbean in her mid-40s with a sharp angular bob. I'm Stephanie Clark, she said, manager of the Grove. Stephanie gave me an unconvincing smile as I shook her hand. I noticed her grip was firmer and tighter than Yuri and rather less welcoming. As manager of this unit, she said safety is my top priority, both the safety of the patients and of the staff. If you aren't safe, then neither are your parents. She proceeded to hand me a small device, a personal attack alarm. Carry this with you at all times. Don't just leave it in your office. I resisted the inclination to say yes, ma'am. Better keep on the tight side of her if I wanted an easy life. That had been my tactic with previous bossy ward managers: avoid confrontation and keep under the radar. Good to meet you, Stephanie, I said, smiling. Stephanie nodded but didn't smile back. Yuri will show you to your office. She turned and marched off without a second glance. Follow me, Yuri said. I went with him to the ward entrance. A large reinforced steel door. Next to it, a metal detector was manned by a security guard. I'm sure you know the drill, Yuri said. No sharp objects, nothing that could be used as a weapon. No lighter, added the security guard as he frisked me, fishing my lighter from my pocket with an accusing look. Sorry, I said, I forgot I had it. Yuri beckoned me to follow him. I will show you to your office, he said. Everyone is a committee meeting, so it's pretty quiet. Can I join them in community? Yuri looked surprised. You don't want to settle in first? I can settle in later if it's all the same to you. He shrugged. Whatever you want this way. He led me down interconnecting corridors, punctuated by locked doors, a rhythm of slams and bolts and keys turning in locks. We made slow progress. It was obvious not much had been spent on the upkeep of the building in several years. Paint was crawling away from the walls, and a faint, musty smell of mildew and decay permeated the corridors. Yuri stopped outside and closed door and nodded. They are in there, he said. Go ahead. Okay, thanks. I hesitated, preparing myself. Then I opened the door and went inside. Community was held in a long room with tall barred windows that overlooked a red brick wall. The smell of coffee was in the air, mingled with traces of Yuri's aftershave. About 30 people were sitting in a circle. Most were clutching paper cups of tea or coffee, yawning and doing their best to wake up. Some, having drunk their coffees, were fidgeting with the empty cups, crumpling, flattening them, or tearing them to shreds. Community met once or twice daily. It was something between an administrative meeting and a group therapy sessions. Items relating to the running of the unit or the patient's care were put on the agenda to be discussed. It was Professor Damades was fond of saying an attempt to involve the patients in their own treatment and encourage them to take responsibility for their well-being. Needless to say, this attempt didn't always work. Damede's background in group therapy meant he had fondness for meeting of all kinds, and he encouraged as much group work as possible. You might say he was at his happiest with an audience. He had the faint air of theatrical impresario, I thought, as he rose to his feet to greet me, hands outstretched in welcome, and beckoned me over. Though there you are, join us, join us. He spoke with a slight Greek accent, barely detectable. He would mostly lost it, having lived in England for over 30 years. He was a handsome man, and although in his 60s he looked much younger, he had a youthful, mischievous manner, more like an irrelevant uncle than a psychiatrist. This isn't to say he wasn't devoted to the patients in a case. He arrived before the cleaners did in the morning and stayed long after the night team had taken over from the day staff, sometimes spending the night on the couch in his office. Twice divorced, Damades was fond of saying his third and most successful marriage was to the Grove. Sit down here, he said, gesturing to an empty chair by his side. Sit, sit, sit. I did as he asked. Damades presented me with a flourish. Allow me to introduce our new psychotherapist, Theo Faber. I hope you will join me in welcoming Theo to our little family. While Damades spoke, I glanced around the circle looking for Alicia, but couldn't see her anywhere. Apart from the Professor Damades, impeccably dressed in suit and tie, the others were mostly in short-sleeved shirts or t-shirts. It was hard to tell who was a patient and who was a member of staff. A couple of faces were familiar to me. Christian, for instance, I had known him at Broadmoor, a rugby-playing psychiatrist with a broken nose and dark beard, good looking in a bashed-up kind of way. He left Broadmoor soon after I arrived. I didn't like Christian much, but to be fair, I hadn't known him well, as we didn't work together for long. I remember Indra, of course, from the interview. She smiled at me, and I was grateful for hers was the only friendly face. The patients mostly glared at me with surely mistrust. I didn't blame them. The abuses they had suffered, physical, psychological, sexual, meant it would be a long time before they had be able to trust me, if ever. The patients were all women, and most had coarse features, lined, scarred. They would had difficult lives, suffering from horrors that had driven them to retreat into no man's land of mental illness. Their journey was etched into their faces, impossible to miss. But Alicia Berenson, where was she? I looked around the circle again, but still couldn't find her, and then I realized I was looking right at her. Alicia was sitting directly opposite to me across the circle. I hadn't seen her because she was invisible. Alicia was slumped forward in the chair. She was obviously highly sedated. She was holding a paper cup full of tea, and her trembling hands was spilling a steady stream of it onto the floor. I restrained myself from going over and straightening her cup. She was so out of it, I doubt she would have noticed if I had. I hadn't expected her to be in such a bad shape. There were some echoes of beautiful woman she had once been. Deep blue eyes, a face of perfect symmetry, but she was too thin and looked unclean. Her long red hair was hanging in a dirty tangled mess around her shoulders. Her fingernails were chewed and torn. Faded scars were visible on both her wrists, the same scars I had seen finally rendered in the Alcestis portrait. Her fingers didn't stop trembling, doubtless a side effect of the drug cocktail she was on. Risperidone and other heavyweight antipsychotics. And glistening saliva was collecting around her open mouth. Uncontrollable drooling being another unfortunate side effect of the medication. I noticed Damades looking at me. I pulled away my attention from Alicia and focused on him. I'm sure you can introduce yourself better than I can, Theo, he said. Won't you say a few words? Thank you. I nodded. I don't really have anything to add, just that I am very happy to be here. excited, nervous, hopeful, and I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone, particularly the patients. I was interrupted by a sudden bang as the door was thrown open. At first, I thought I was seeing things. A giant charged into the room, holding two jagged wooden spikes, which she raised high above her head and then threw at us like spears. One of the patients covered her eyes and screamed. I half expected the spears to impale us, but they landed with some force on the floor in the middle of the circle, and then I saw they weren't spears at all. It was a pool cue snapped into the massive patient. A dark haired Turkish woman in her 40s shouted, "Pisses me off. Pool cue been broken a week and you still ain't fucking replaced it?" "Watch your language, Aleph," said Damades. "I'm not prepared to discuss the matter of the pool cue until we decide whether it's appropriate to allow you to join community at such a late juncture." He turned his head slyly and threw the question at me. "What do you think, Theo?" I blinked and took a second to find my voice. "I think it's important to respect time boundaries and arrive on time for community." "Like you did, you mean?" said a man across the circle. I turned and saw it was a Christian who was spoken. He laughed, amused by his own joke. I forced a smile and turned back to Elif. "He is quite right. I was also late this morning, so maybe it's a lesson we can learn together." "What you on about?" Alif said. "Who the fuck are you? Anyway, Alif, mind your language," said Damades. "Don't make me put you on timeout. Sit down." Alif remained standing. "And what about the pool cue?" The question was addressed to Damades, and he looked at me, waiting for me to answer it. "Alif, I can see you are angry about the pool cue," I said. "I suspect whoever broke it was also angry. It raises the question of what we do with anger in an institution like this. How about we stick with that and talk about the anger for a moment? Won't you sit down?" Alif rolled her eyes, but she sat down. Indra nodded. "Look, pleased." We started talking about anger, Indra and I trying to draw the patients into a discussion about their angry feelings. We worked well together. I thought I could sense Damades watching, evaluating my performance. He seemed satisfied. I glanced at Alicia, and to my surprise, she was looking at me, or at least in my direction. There was a dim fogginess in her expression, as if it were a struggle to focus her eyes and see. If you told me this broken shell had once been the brilliant Alicia Berenson, described by those who knew her as a dazzling, fascinating, full of life, I simply wouldn't have believed you. I knew then and there I would made the right decision in coming to the grove. All my doubts vanished. I became resolved to stop at nothing until Alicia became my patient. There was no time to waste. Alicia was lost, she was missing, and I intended to find her. Professor Damides' office was located in the most disrepute part of the hospital. There were cobwebs in the corners, and only a couple of the lights in the corridor were working. I knocked at the door, and there was a moment's pause before I heard his voice from inside. "Come in." I turned the handle and the door cracked open. I was immediately struck by the smell inside the room. It smelled different from the rest of the hospital. It didn't smell like antiseptic or bleach, rather bizarrely. It smelled like an orchestra pit. It smelled of woods, strings, and bows, polish and wax. It took a moment for my eyes to become accustomed to the gloom. Then I noticed the upright piano against the wall, an incongruous object in a hospital. 20 odd metallic music stands gleamed in the shadows, and a stack of sheet music was piled high on a table. An unsteady paper tower reaching for the sky. A violin was on another table, next on an oboe and a flute, and beside it a harp, a huge thing with a beautiful wooden frame and a shower of strings. I stared at it and open mouthed. Damades laughed. You are wondering about the instruments, he said. He sat behind his desk, chuckling. Are they yours? They are. Music is my hobby. No, I lie. It is my passion. He pointed his finger in the air dramatically. The professor had an animated way of speaking, employing a wide range of hand gestures to accompany and underscore his speech, as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. I run an informal music group, he said, open to whoever wishes to join. Staff and patients alike. I find music to be a most effective therapeutic tool. He paused to recite in a lilting musical tone. Music has charms to soothe a savage breast. Do you agree? I'm sure you're right. Hmm. Demades peered at me for a moment. Do you play? Play what? Anything. A triangle is a start. I shook my head. I'm not very musical. I played the recorder a bit at school when I was young. That was about it. Then you can read music. That is an advantage. Good. Choose an instrument, I will teach you. I smiled and again shook my head. I'm afraid I'm not patient enough. No. Well, patience is a virtue you would do well to cultivate as a psychotherapist. You know, in my mouth, I was undecided whether I should be a musician, a priest, doctor. Damaris laughed, and now I am all three. I suppose that's true. You know, he said, switching subject without even a hint of a pause. I was the deciding voice at your interview, the casting vote so as to speak. I spoke strongly in your favor, so you know why? I'll tell you. I saw something in you. Theo, you remind me of myself. Who knows? In a few years, you might be running this place. He left the sentence dangling for a moment, then sighed. Ah, if it's still here, of course. Who knows? Too few patients, too many staff. We are working in close cooperation with the trust to see if a more economically viable model can be found, which means we are being endlessly watched, evaluated, spied upon. How can we possibly do therapeutic work under such conditions? You might well ask. As Winnicott said, you can't practice therapy in a building. He shook his head and looked his age suddenly, exhausted and weary. He lowered his voice and spoke in a conspirational whisper. I believe the manager, Stephanie Clark, is in league with them. The trust pays her salary, after all. Watch her and you will see what I mean. I thought Diomedes was sounding a little paranoid, but perhaps that was understandable. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, so I remained diplomatically silent for a moment and then. I want to ask you something, I said, about Alicia. Alicia Berenson? Diomedes gave me a strange look. What about her? I'm curious what kind of therapeutic work is being done with her. Is she an individual therapy? No. Is there a reason? It was tried and abandoned. Why was that? Who saw her? Indira? No. Diomedes shook his head. I saw Alicia myself, as a matter of fact. I see. What happened? He shrugged. She refused to visit me in my office, so I went to see her in her room. During the sessions, she simply sat on her bed and stared out of the window. She refused to speak, of course. She refused to even look at me. He threw up his hand, exasperated. I decided the whole thing was a waste of her time. I nodded. I suppose, well, I am wondering about the transference. Yes, Diomedes peered at me with curiosity. Go on. It's possible, isn't it, that she experienced you as an authoritarian presence, perhaps potentially punitive. I don't know what her relationship with her father was like, but Diomedes listened with a small smile, as if he were being told a joke and anticipating the punchline. But you think she might find it easier to relate to someone younger? He said, let me guess, someone like you. You think you can help her, Theo? You can rescue Alicia? Make her talk? I don't know about rescuing her, but I would like to help her. I would like to try. Damity smiled, still with the same sense of amusement. You're not the first. I believed I would succeed. Alicia is a silent siren, my boy, luring us to the rocks, where we dash our therapeutic ambitions to pieces. He smiled. She taught me a valuable lesson in failure. Perhaps you need to learn the same lesson. I met his gaze defiantly. Unless, of course, I succeed. Damidy's smile vanished, replaced by something harder to read. He remained silent for a moment, then made a decision. We'll see, shall we? First, you must meet Alicia. You have not been introduced to her yet. Have you? Not yet, no. Then ask Yuri to arrange it, will you? Report back to me afterwards. Good. I said, trying to conceal my excitement. I will. The therapy room was a small space, a narrow rectangle, as bare as a prison cell or a barrier. The window was closed and barred. A bright pink box of tissues on the small table struck a discordantly cheerful note. Presumably, it was placed there by Indira. I couldn't imagine Christian offering tissues to his patients. I sat on one of two battered, faded armchairs. The minutes passed, no sign of Alicia. Perhaps she wasn't coming. Perhaps she had refused to meet me. She would be perfectly within her rights. Impatient, anxious, nervous, I abandoned sitting and jumped up and walked to the window. I peered out between the bars. The courtyard was 3 stories below me. It was the size of a tennis court and surrounded by a tall red brick wall. Walls there were too high to climb, though doubtless some had tried. Patients were herded outside for 30 minutes of fresh air every afternoon, whether they wanted it or not, and in this freezing weather I didn't blame them for resisting. Some stood alone, muttering, or themselves, or they packed back and forth like restless zombies going nowhere. Others huddled in groups, talking, smoking, in arguing voices and shouts, and strange, excitable laughter floated up to me. I couldn't see Alicia at first. Then I located her. She was standing alone at the far end of the courtyard by the wall, perfectly still like a statue. Yuri walked across the courtyard towards her. He spoke to the nurse standing a few feet away. The nurse nodded. Yuri went up to Alicia cautiously, slowly, as you might approach an unpredictable animal. I had asked him not to go into too much detail, merely to tell Alicia the new psychotherapist at the unit would like to meet her. I requested he phrase it as a request, not a demand. Alicia stood still as he spoke to her, but she neither nodded nor shook her head, nor gave any indication of having heard him. There was a brief pause, and then Yuri turned and walked off. Well, that's it. I thought she won't come. Fuck it. I should have known the whole thing has been a waste of time. And then, to my surprise, Alicia took a step forward, faltering a little. She followed Yuri, shuffling after him across the courtyard, until they disappeared from the view under my window. So she was coming. I tried to contain my nerves and prepare myself. I tried to silence the negative voices in my head. My father's voice telling me I wasn't up to the job, I was useless, a fraud. Shut up. I thought, shut up, shut up. A couple of minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Come in, I said. The door opened. Alicia was standing with Yuri in the corridor. I looked at her, but she didn't look at me. Her gaze remained downcast. Yuri gave me a proud smile. She's here. Yes, I can see that. Hello, Alicia. She didn't respond. Won't you come in? Yuri leaned forward as if to nudge her, but he didn't actually touch her. Instead, he whispered, Go on, honey, go in and take a seat. Alicia hesitated a moment. She glanced at him, then made a decision. She walked into the room slightly unsteadily. She sat on a chair, silent as a cat, her trembling hands in her lap. I was about to shut the door, but Yuri didn't leave. I lowered my voice. I can take it from here, thanks. Yuri looked worried, but she's on one. And the professor said, I'll take full responsibility. It's quite alright. I take my personal attack alarm out of my pocket. See, I have this, but I won't need it. I glanced at Alicia. She gave no indication. She had even heard me. Yuri shrugged, obviously unhappy. I'll be on the other side of the door just in case you need me. That's not necessary, but thanks. Yuri left, and I closed the door. I placed the alarm on the desk. I sat opposite Alicia. She didn't look up. I studied her for a moment. Her face was expressionless, blank, a medicated mask. I wondered what lay beneath. I'm glad you agreed to see me, I said. I waited for a response. I knew there wouldn't be one. I went on. I have the advantage of knowing more about you than you do about me. Your reputation precedes you. Your reputation as a painter, I mean, I'm a fan of your work. No reaction. I shifted in my seat slightly. I asked Professor Dermades if we might talk, and he kindly arranged this meeting. Thank you for agreeing to it. I hesitated, hoping for an acknowledgement of some kind, a blink, a nod, a frown. Nothing came. I tried to guess what she was thinking. Perhaps she was too drugged up to think anything at all. I thought of my old therapist, Ruth. What would she do? She used to say we are made up of different parts, some good, some bad, and that a healthy mind can tolerate this ambivalence and juggle both good and bad at the same time. Mental illness is precisely about a lack of this kind of integration. We end up losing contact with unacceptable parts of ourselves. If I were to help Alicia, we would have to locate the parts she had hidden from herself beyond the fringes of consciousness and connect with the various dots in her mental landscape. Only then could we put into context the terrible events of that night she killed her husband. It would be a slow, laborious process. Normally, when beginning with a patient, there is no sense of urgency, no predetermined therapeutic agenda. Normally, we start with many months of talking. In an ideal world, Alicia would tell me about herself, her life, her childhood. I would listen, slowly building up a picture until it was complete enough for me to make accurate, helpful interpretations. In this case, there would be no talking, no listening, and the information I needed would have to be gathered through non-verbal clues, such as my counterphrasings, the feelings Alicia engendered in me during the sessions, and whatever information I could gather from other sources. In other words, I had set into motion a plan to help Alicia without actually knowing how to execute it, and now I had to deliver, not just to prove myself to Damaris, but far more importantly to do my duty to Alicia to help her. Looking at her sitting opposite me, in a medicated haze, drool collected around her mouth, fingers flirting like dirty moths, I experienced a sudden and unexpected wrench of sadness. I felt desperately sorry for her and those like her, for all of us, all the wounded and the lost. Of course, I said none of this to her. Instead, I did what Ruth would have done, and we simply sat in silence. I opened Alicia's file on my desk. Damaris had volunteered it. You must read my notes, he said. They will help you. I had no desire to wade through his notes. I already knew what Damaris thought. I needed to find out what I thought. But nonetheless, I accepted it politely. Thank you. That will be such a help. My office was small and sparsely furnished, tucked away at the back of the building where the fire escape. I looked out of the window. A little blackbird was pecking at a patch of frozen grass on the ground outside, dispiritedly and without much hope. I shivered. The room was freezing, the small radiator under the window was broken. Yuri said he would try and get it fixed, but that my best bet was to talk to Stephanie, or failing that, bring it up in community. I felt a sudden pang of empathy with Elif and her battle to get the broken pool cue replaced. I looked through Alicia's file without much expectation. The majority of the information I needed was on the online database. Demades, however, like a lot of older staff members, preferred to write his reports by hand and, ignoring Stephanie's nagging requests for the contrary, continued to do so. Hence the dog-eared file in the front of me. I flicked through Demades' notes, ignoring his somewhat old-fashioned psychoanalytic interpretations, and focused on the nurse's daily handover reports that kept an account of Alicia's day-to-day behavior. I read through those reports carefully. I wanted facts, figures, details. I needed to know exactly what was going into, what I had have to deal with, and if there were any surprises in store. In the end, the file revealed very little. When she was first admitted, Alicia slashed her wrist twice and self-harmed with whatever she could get her hands on. She was kept on 2-on-1 observation for the first 6 months, meaning two nurses watched over her at all times, which was eventually relaxed to 1-on-1. Alicia made no effort to interact with patients or staff, remaining withdrawn and isolated, and for the most part, the other patients had left her alone. If someone doesn't reply when you speak to them and never initiates a conversation, you soon forget they are. Alicia had quickly melted into the background, becoming invisible. Only one incident stood out. It took place in the canteen a few weeks after Alicia's admission. Elif accused Alicia of taking her seat. It was unclear exactly what happened, but the confrontation escalated rapidly. Apparently, Alicia became violent. She smashed a plate and tried to slash Elif's throat with the jagged edge. She had to be restrained, sedated, and placed in isolation. I wasn't sure why this incident drew my attention, but it didn't feel right to me. I decided to approach Elif and ask her about it. I tore off a sheet of paper from a pad and reached for my pen. An old habit formed at university. Something about the process of putting pen to paper helps me organize my mind. I have always had difficulty formulating an opinion until I have written it down. I began scribbling ideas, notes, goals, devising a plan of attack. In order to help Alicia, I needed to understand her and her relationship with Gabriel. Did she love him, hate him, and why she had refused to speak to the murder, or anything else about the murder? No answers, not yet, just questions. I wrote down a word and underlined it as Alcestis. The self-portrait was important, and somehow I knew that, and understanding why would be central to locking this mystery. This painting was Alicia's sole communication, her only testimony, and it was saying something I had yet to comprehend. I made a note to revisit the gallery to look at the painting again. I wrote down another word: childhood. If I were to make sense of Gabriel's murder, I needed to understand not only the events of the night Alicia killed him, but also the events of the distant past. The seeds of what happened in those few minutes when she shot her husband were probably sown years earlier. Murderous rage, homicidal rage, is not born in the present. It originates in the land before memory, in the world of early childhood, with abuse and mistreatment at a young age, which builds up a charge over the years until it explodes, often at the wrong targets. I needed to find out how her childhood had shaped her. And if Alicia's couldn't or wouldn't tell me, I had to find someone who would. Someone who knew Alicia before the murder, who could help me to understand her history, who she was, and how she ended up this way. In the file, Alicia's next of kin was listed as her aunt, Lydia Rose, who brought her up following the death of Alicia's mother in a car accident. Alicia's had also been in the car crash but survived. That trauma must have affected the little girl profoundly. I hoped Lydia would be able to tell me about it. The only other contact was Alicia's solicitor, Max Branson. Max was Gabriel's Branson brother. As such, he was perfectly placed to observe their marriage on an intimate basis. Whether or not Max Branson would confide in me was another matter. An unsolicited approach to Alicia's family by her psychotherapist was unorthodox to say the least. I had a dim feeling Damaris would not approve. Better not ask his permission, I decided in case he refused. Looking back, this way was first professional transgression in dealing with Alicia, setting an unfortunate precedent for what followed. I should have stopped there, but even then it was too late to stop. In many ways, my fate was already decided like in a Greek tragedy. I reached for the phone. I called Max Benson at his office using the contact number listed in Alicia's file. It rang several times before it was answered. The offices of Elliot Barrow and Berenson's said a receptionist was bold called. Mr. Berenson, please may I ask who is calling? My name is Theo Faber. I'm a psychotherapist. I was wondering if it might be possible to have a word with Mr. Berenson about his sister-in-law. There was a slight pause before she responded. Oh, I see. Well, Mr. Berenson is out of the office for the rest of the week. He is in Edinburgh visiting a client. If you leave your number, I will have him call you on his return. I gave her my number and hung up. I dialed the next number in the file. Alicia's Aunt Lydia rose. This time it was answered on the first ring. An elderly woman's voice sounded breathless and rather annoyed. Yes, what is it? Is that Miss Rose? Who are you? I'm calling regarding your niece, Alicia Berenson. I'm a psychotherapist working at the fuck off, she said, and hung up. I frowned to myself. Not a good start. I desperately needed a cigarette. As we left the grove, I looked for them in my coat pockets, but they weren't there. Looking for something, I turned round. Yuri was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard him, and I was a little startled to find him so close. I found them in the nurse's station. He sat, grinning, handing me a pack of cigarettes. Must have fallen out of your pocket. Thanks. I took them and lit one. I offered him the packet. Yuri shook his head. I don't smoke. Not cigarettes anyway, he laughed. You look like you need a drink. Come on, I'll buy you a pint. I hesitated. My instinct was to refuse. I had never been one for socializing with work colleagues, and I doubted Yuri and I had much in common. But he probably knew Alicia better than anyone at the Grove, and his insights might prove useful. Sure, I said, why not? We went to a pub near the station. I slaughtered lamb, dark and dingy. It had seen better days. So had the old men dozing over their half-finished paints. Yuri got us a couple of beers and we sat at a table at the back. Yuri took a long swig of beer and wiped his mouth. Well, he said, tell me about Alicia. Alicia, how did you find her? I'm not sure I did find her. Yuri gave me a quizzical look, then smiled. She doesn't want to be found. Yeah, it's true. She's hiding. You are close to her. I can see that. I take special care of her. No one knows her like I do. Not even Professor Damaris. There was a boastful note for his voice. It annoyed me for some reason. I wondered how well he really knew her or if he were just bragging. What do you make of her silence? What do you think it means? Yuri shrugged. I guess it means she's not ready to talk. She'll really not really to talk and she'll talk when she's ready. Ready for what? Ready for the truth, my friend. And what is that? Yuri cocked his head to one side slightly, studying me. And the question that came out of his mouth surprised me. Are you married, Theo? I nodded. I'm yes. Yeah, I thought so. I was married once too. We moved here from Latvia, but she didn't fit in like I did. She didn't make an effort. She didn't learn English. Anyway, I wasn't happy, but I was in denial, lying to myself. He drained his drink and completed his sentence until I fell in love. Presumably, you don't mean with your wife. He laughed and shook his head. No, a woman who lived near me, a very beautiful woman. It was love at first sight. I saw her on a street. It took me a long time to get the courage to talk her. I used to follow her. I had watched her sometimes without her knowing. I had stand outside her house and look, hoping she would appear at the window. He laughed. This story was starting to make me feel uncomfortable. I finished my beer and glanced at my watch, hoping Yuri would take his hint, but he didn't. One day he said I tried speaking to her, but she wasn't interested in me. I tried a few times, but she told me to stop pestering her. I didn't blame her. I thought I was about to make my excuses, but Yuri kept talking. It was very hard to accept, he said. I was sure we were meant to be together. She broke my heart. I got very angry with her, very mad. And what happened? I asked, curious despite myself. Nothing. Nothing. You stayed with your wife? Yuri shook his head. No, it was over with her, but it took falling for this woman for me to admit it, to face the truth about me and my wife. Sometimes it takes courage, you know, and a long time to be honest. I see. And you think Alicia is not ready to face the truth about her marriage? Is that what you are saying? You may well be right. Yuri shrugged, and now I am engaged to a nice girl from Hungary. She worked in spa, she speaks good English, we are a good match, we have a good time. I nodded and checked my watch again. I picked up my coat. I have to go. I am late to meet my wife. Okay, no problem. What's her name? Your wife. For some reason, I didn't want to tell him. I didn't want Yuri to know anything about her. But that was stupid. Catherine. I said her name is Catherine, but I call her Kathy. Yuri gave me an odd smile. Let me give you some advice, he said. Go home to your wife, go home to Kathy, who loves you, and leave Alicia behind.